right, everybody. Welcome to the TrialSite News podcast interview series. I'm Dr. Erin, your host, and today we will be chatting with Dr. Jim Reilly from Veeva. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Erin. And just to be clear, I'm not a doctor, although I like the unofficial title.
Well, I gave you an unofficial title. Okay, sometimes it happens on this podcast. Can you tell us a little bit about your company, Veeva? What do you guys do?
Sure. Yeah. So Veeva is a 15-year-old company. And I think about Veeva in three ways. We are a software, data, and services company, but we're one that's focused on life sciences. So the pharmaceutical and biotech space. And we offer capabilities that really help these pharmaceutical organizations, as well as research sites and now patients, with the end-to-end journey of both developing a product, but also commercializing that product. So it's sort of an end-to-end offering of everything that an organization needs to develop, but also commercialize. And we think we're pretty unique in that regard by being that holistic.
And the topic today we wanted to cover is the future of clinical trials. It's a hot topic right now in the clinical trial space. You recently wrote an op-ed for TrialSite News, which talked about overcoming the growing pains of decentralized trials. There's a lot more attention in this area because of COVID-19 and people couldn't meet in person and that sort of thing. Yeah. Before we get into the growing pains, for people who may not know, for lay people, can you describe what a decentralized trial is?
Yeah, and I think about it in simple terms because I'm a simple guy. Decentralized is all about where a trial is conducted. So we know what trials are. That's where a pharmaceutical sponsor runs research. And they run that research by partnering with research sites where physicians and staff reside to provide a trial therapy to patients. Well, traditionally, that involves a patient coming to that research site, whether it's an independent provider or as part of a hospital system. And decentralized trials is a newer concept. It says, well, why does it always have to be in person? Patients sometimes have difficulty getting to a physical site. It could be far away. They could have, their own disabilities in getting there. So why does it have to be in person? Can there be elements of the trial that are not in person at a physical research site? So I'm talking about things like a home health nurse visiting a patient in their own home, right, to provide them the therapy or to ask them questions about their progress in the trial. Or like you and I are doing now, it could be you're telehealthing in, you're using something like Zoom or some other web technology to interact with the physician or the caretaker at that research site. So again, it's really all about providing flexibility to the patient in terms of where they are.
Okay, great. And I love the simple explanations. I think everybody can kind of latch onto them and get the idea, which is important here. I really liked your op-ed, and could you go through some of the growing pains that we're seeing with people who may be trying to adopt decentralized trials, or some of the shortcomings that may have been highlighted?
Yeah. So first, I just want to say that decentralized trials are a good thing. So in no way you're going to hear me disparage the notion of what decentralized trials are. I think it's a good thing that we provide this option to patients so that they don't always have to physically be in person at a research site. I also don't think research sites are going away. We can talk about that maybe as one of our follow-up points. But I think as good as the idea of decentralized trials are, we're learning about how they need to run, and it's not perfected yet. Before COVID, there absolutely was this notion of decentralized trials, and some pharmaceutical companies were running decentralized trials before COVID. And then COVID hit, and it was sort of like, whoa, we have to do everything remotely now. And thankfully, we had this as an option. So that's a wonderful thing. And so many pharma they went from dipping their toe in to sort of diving headlong into, okay, I got to run my trials in this decentralized way. So we learned a lot then in the midst of the pandemic about, well, how decentralized trials work and how can they be improved. So I think there's three things that come to mind. One is patient-centric. So the idea of decentralized trials itself is patient-centric, as I mentioned earlier, but we can do better. If we have patients engaging with a research site using technology, like this web experience you and I are having, or like a mobile device where they're being asked questions about their experience in the trial, there's a lot left to be desired there. There's technology vendors banging around in that space, but it's not been perfected. It's not consumer-like. Like when you and I buy something online, it's the easiest thing in the world because it should be. Amazon wants our money, right? So for a patient, it needs to feel that way. Like, I'm engaging in a trial. This needs to be so easy for me. I need to like the trial, and my journey in the trial needs to be very clear. And I think we're still learning there. There's still a lot of improvement to be made in how the technology needs to work to be centric to the patient. But the other side is the sites, right? These investigators and their staff who work with patients, they have a tough life. I talk to a lot of sites, and there's a lot of research that's been done with research sites. And one of the primary pain points that they've shared is there is so much technology being thrust on them. So many sponsors are saying, use my tool to collect information. No, use mine. Or the sites are having technology providers sell technology to them to manage their own shop. And so the life of a site, which used to be, okay, I see a patient, I collect information on paper, and I put it in a binder, is now incredibly more complex, actually, due to technology. And that's upside down, right? Technology is supposed to make things easier. So I think for the site, we have to focus on making that world of technology for them a simpler and better endeavor than it is now. And then the last thing is the sponsors, the ones who are running this research and paying for it, they need to put together a package of data when all is said and done that goes to an FDA or an EMA in Europe that says, this is why I think my product is safe and efficacious. Well, in order for them to do that, they have to collect all of that data that's coming from the research sites and the patients. Well, with all this technology now banging around, it's actually become more difficult for them to bring all that data in, normalize it, put it together in a nice package in a bow, and send it to a health authority. But when you think about it, again, technology should help. We need a better way for that data, when it's collected from patients, to just go right to the sponsor. So that's some of the things that I think we're learning as an industry that need to improve with these decentralized trials.
You mentioned patient-centric, and I've heard that word thrown around a lot recently when people are talking about improving clinical trials. Is there a difference between or among the patient-centered digital trial versus decentralized versus virtual?
Oh, yeah, because it can get confusing, right? There's a lot of terminology.
Yeah, I don't think I know the difference. So.
I didn't really either until I think pretty recently. So decentralized, I think you were clear on, it's about the where. And I think that definition is now pretty standard in industry, thankfully. There used to be that term virtual. You don't really hear it as much, but it used to be the in vogue term, because initially when this idea of, hey, let's use technology to bring the trial to the patient, a lot of people sort of jumped to the conclusion that meant, oh, well, you don't need a physical site anymore. Why don't we just have everybody on Zoom and sending home health nurses, and now we don't need a physical site. And that's what the notion of virtual meant. Like, can I run a trial that's truly virtualized, where I don't have the physical brick and mortar research site? But I think as we've come to learn, you can't run trials that way. Two reasons. One is just a lot of therapy areas don't lend themselves to that. Like, you have to go to the site, for instance, to receive an oncology therapy. That's not really something you do in the home. But secondly, patients still crave in person. There's a lot of people, and it kind of spans generations, right? So up and down the generation pool, that want to see people in person still, even coming out of the pandemic. They yearn for that personal care. So virtual, not really in vogue, and I don't think it's something that's really going to happen. There could be a couple of therapy areas where it can make a little bit of sense, like something like neuro-oriented diseases, but in general, no one's really looking at virtual. But then there's this word digital. And this is one that at Veeva, we've been very passionate about, because digital actually means taking the paper out of the equation, right? That's what digital means. And even with decentralized trials, you can have a home health nurse visiting a patient, but they're bringing their paper binder with them, and they're taking the notes and they're capturing all the information that way. And then it goes back to the physical site where someone hand keys that information in, looking at the page. That's not efficient, right? And that's not digital. So digital trials are sort of like the combination of decentralizing things, but also taking the paper out of the equation. And the way that you do that is with good technology.
Okay. When you were talking about patient-centered, what I liked when you mentioned in your op-ed how older people may respond to technology differently than younger populations. So just, in terms of recruitment and getting people to fill out different things or getting them to understand the technology might be a learning curve, or you might have to do different approaches.
Yeah, exactly. But that's not one size fits all. I'm not making broad stroke claims about elderly populations, because actually, in fact, what we're also learning from the millennial population is that many of them crave the in-person, right? Interestingly.
Right. Yes.
So, but you do find that, look, some people are just going to be tech averse or just not as tech friendly due to whatever circumstance.
Not age dependent. Yeah.
Not age dependent. So you have to give them options, right? And so it could be that the technology is at the site so that when the patient comes in and let's say they receive a therapy, then sometimes there's these follow-up instruments, questionnaires that are provided. Again, oftentimes those were paper. Well, instead of saying, well, patient, you need to have this app on your phone and then fill it out. How about giving them the option? Okay, do you have a smartphone? Great, here's an app. Or I have a tablet here. Let me walk through with you how to use it, and it's collecting the same information.
Right. And I think that would be great, having those options. I want to talk to you about the Veeva clinical trials survey that you ran. Yes. You had responses from 280 clinical leaders, if I understood it correctly.
That's right.
27% said they ran decentralized clinical trials before COVID, then it was 87%. However, only 56%, or a little over half, said that the decentralized clinical trials improved the patient experience. And I know we've been talking about this, but can you elaborate on that? What the survey found, what do you think we can do to improve that?
Yeah. So there's a couple elements there that I think are important, and some relate to the survey and some don't. I'm just going to throw one statistic out. It's probably the only one I'll share in our conversation. And that is that only 4% of the US population engages in clinical research, right? Have actually participated in a clinical trial.
Yeah.
That's low, right? Now, I'm not suggesting 100%, right? Some people aren't sick. What are you going to a clinical trial for? But it shouldn't be 4%. It needs to be more. There are a lot more people who have ailments that could benefit from taking part in a clinical trial. The evolution I'm seeing, and I think many are seeing, is that clinical trials need to just become another element of care. Okay, you come into the hospital or you come into the physician and you say, I have this ailment. And they say, well, there is this therapy that already exists that's approved, or I know of these 5 other trials that are ongoing that might be an option for you. That level of education is just simply not happening broadly. And beyond just in the physician's office, I think also technology can help. So many of us use, things like Google, et cetera. And many people that are sick are trying to find, well, hey, I have this, I have rosacea. What do I do about it? Okay. Usually they're pointed to an approved product on market and they see a commercial about it or they see an ad for it. Well, I think we need a better way that's accessible to all so that when they search for a condition they have, they're actually directed to, okay, there's products on market for you, but there's also trials out there for you. And unfortunately, that's kind of locked up right now in individual sponsor web pages. Like you have to be directed to a sponsor's webpage to find out more about their trial therapies. I think we can democratize that, right? So that finding research can just be a lot easier. So that's the finding research part. But as you point to with this trial, it was about the survey. The trial itself, can it improve patient experience? And the results still aren't that strong. And it kind of points to many of the reasons I suggested before. We're still learning. And I think one of the ways in which we just need to vastly improve is to make that experience much better for the patient, that technology experience. I'll give you an example. There are some vendors out there, technology vendors, who, when you sign up for a trial and you use that technology, you actually have multiple apps on your phone to use. Well, are you being consented? Use this app. Are you responding to a survey? Use this app. Are you scheduling a visit with your research site? Use this app. That is not, easy, right? That is not simple
Yeah.
for a patient. And
Sounds overwhelming.
It's overwhelming. So their journey in a trial just needs to be simplified with technology, not made more complex.
I like that. If you had to choose your top 3 to 5 things to make digital clinical trials a reality, what would they be?
3 to 5. All right.
But it doesn't have to be that number. Maybe 2 to 4.
I'll do my best at 3, maybe 4. Okay. So I think first is, let me use a metaphor. The banking industry. The banking industry 30 years ago, you couldn't walk up to an ATM, right, and pull out money. You had to visit your actual bank, right, your physical bank that you have an account with, just to get money out, right, or deposit money. And then along came ATMs, and now you can go anywhere, just go to that machine, and you have cash. And actually, frankly, cash is going away. Venmo, PayPal, et cetera. But let's take the ATM example. That's a lot like the technology industry right now with these decentralized trials. There are all these different tool sets by different vendors that do different things. And when you're on a trial as a patient or you're a research site, all this stuff is getting thrown at you, and there's no commonality. It's not a consistent experience. And I think that needs to change. I think there are going to have to be some winners in the technology space. And to me, the short answer is we just need a platform ecosystem that just says, hey, if you're a patient, this is the app you get. If you're a site, this is the app that you can use and that you'll love. And if you're a sponsor, you can use this and all your data flows in. And just call it a day, because that is simple. That takes the paper out. It's centric on the needs of the patient, and it takes away all this kind of piece parts that are floating around there. So that's one way I think we can improve things. The other is that I think sponsors and research sites can work better together. I think it's been historically a little bit of a throw it over the wall kind of relationship. I'm a sponsor. I send you a survey that gauges whether you might be interested in the trial. You fill out the survey, you send it back to me, and then I score you against others, and I tell you if I'm going to choose you. And that's kind of centric on the sponsor, isn't it? I think that we need to provide ways in which the sites can be aware of potential research, so they can raise their hand and say, "Oh, I found this kind of trial out there from you, Pfizer, or you, BMS. I want to put my hand up as potentially willing to engage in that kind of trial, because I have that experience." It's not happening that way right now. So I think the more bi-directional collaboration is important. The third is the patient side, right? I mentioned the 4% statistic, but I think we need to really drive the awareness of trials out there in the public. So there's all kinds of ways to do that socially, right? Through social media, through physical advertising, but also I just think there's a technical answer to this as well. Like there is Google to find information, there should be a website for finding any trial that can help you with your ailment. It doesn't exist today.
I liked what you wrote in your op-ed, how the industry's back office needs to come to the front office of the sites and be more, and I think your number 2 there is touching on that issue, if I'm correct. I mean, so it seems like it's more of a historical problem, not just related to maybe decentralized trials. Is that your take?
Yeah, I absolutely think you're right about that. Because I mean, dating back before technology, where let's just go to the email days, much of the relationship was email oriented. Hey, I found your email address, University of Stanford. Are you interested in this trial? Let me tell you more about it. You fill out a survey, you send it back to me. We haven't done much better than that. Okay, maybe it's not on email as much anymore, although it still is in many cases. But now they have these things called portals, which are sort of the same idea, but now it's got a fancy name. It's a portal, but it's still this kind of one-sided ask. It needs to be bidirectional. So that you're right about that. The other thing, though, with the whole back office and front office thing, as you call out, is that data problem I was mentioning. I know that's not, that doesn't feel relevant to a patient or a site, because they're doing the research and they got to get it done, and the patient needs to feel better. That's mission number 1. But if we want that therapy on the market as fast as we possibly can get it to help the greater good of society, we want to get that information to the FDA faster, right? Well, if I'm going to throw a lot more technology as we are today into the equation, I actually have the potential to slow down the ability to collect all of that data, package it up, and send it to the FDA. That's sort of the inverse of what we want. So I think this idea of the data sharing between the back office, which is the sponsor, and the front office, which is the research site and the patient, that needs to come together, and it just needs to flow. And if we get to that point where it's much closer to real time, we should actually expect that submissions for products to FDA should happen sooner than they do today.
Makes sense. Last question for you here. If a company is out there thinking about how do I improve our clinical trial operations, where do they start? Where do they go?
Yeah, well, I think there are teams within pharmaceutical companies that focus on site engagement or site monitoring and site engagement. I think I'm hearing from a lot of these groups that they're looking to evolve themselves to be much more site focused. So that's a good thing. We're heading that way. Back to what I was saying earlier about it needs to be a little bit more playing at both sides. The other is you've got to think about the patient first, not just in the engagement, like when the trial is ongoing, but much earlier. Protocols today, which are the instructions for the trial, right, to the research site, are incredibly complex. They've become more complex over time. There's all kinds of criteria that say why a patient should be excluded from research. And it means finding patients is like finding a needle in a haystack. So I think that we need to be thinking about the needs of the patient population much earlier, even as we design the protocol, so we can expand the potential population of patients that could be helped by this therapy. And I guess the last thing would be have a plan for the data, like I was talking about earlier. It might sound sort of boring, but in the end, it matters because it's the result. It's the result of getting a therapy to a market faster. So if you have a good plan for how your data needs to flow from the patients and from the research sites and how you kind of aggregate that to tell the story, then you're going to be better off, and we're going to be better off as a society because these treatments will get in our hands sooner.
Jim, thank you so much for your time today. That was very interesting. If anyone wants to check out Veeva, is it just veeva.com or?
Yes, www.veeva.com.
That's simple enough. We're talking about keeping it simple. Thanks to our viewers for joining us today on TrialSite News. Hope you stick around and subscribe.